Hello, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for another exciting episode of Answers That Count. I'm your host, Charles Musgrove. Thank you for joining us. And please remember to hit the subscribe button that you see down below. Hit the subscribe and you can hit the bell so that you're notified. That just lets you get notified when we post another video. We try to post these videos on a weekly basis. Sometimes we've got more than one that we post each week. So thank you for tuning in, and we try to provide the answers that you're to the questions that you're asking. How to run your business better, what can make a difference in your business. We're trying to answer questions about economic theory and how to relate theory to what's going on in today's economic environment that we're all living in. And man, what a year that has been in 2020. So we're not through with it yet. We still got another month or so to go in 2020. Today is December 4th, and I'm coming to you from 30A Studio in Santa Rosa Beach, Florida, and I'm in Studio A for Answers That Count, and we've got Professor Joe Calhoun from Florida State University joining us on the show today. Thank you, Professor Joe, for joining us.
Well, great to be here. I'll call myself in Studio F for Florida State University.
I like that, Studio F, and thank you for joining us. This is going to be another great show. Man, we are going to talk about something that, people forget, and it's something that may sound dirty, but it's the budget deficit that we have as the United States. So it's one of those things that people, they may give lip service to, but it's one of those things that is just hard for people to pay attention to, and it's hard for politicians to address it and try to reduce that budget deficit, or even spend less on an annual basis than tax revenue that's taken in. So this is a problem that is not going away, but it is a problem that people have been very quick to kick down the road and let somebody else deal with it. So Joe, I'm going to rely on you to be objective in this and give us some economic theory on this. So I'm looking forward to the show.
Well, great. Yeah, we're definitely, this is not a Democrat versus Republican. This is just how politicians act. It doesn't matter what letter they have after their name. They're all going to act in a very similar way. So this is very bipartisan. There's no reason that we need to throw names around. We're just trying to understand behavior.
Absolutely. And this is one thing that really in these shows that we've done about economy and economics is this is really objective in the viewpoint. The book was written way before what we're dealing with now in current economic times, but it's relevant. What we see is written in economic theory. We can see how it plays out. And one of the things that just keeps coming to us over and over is incentives matter. Incentives really drive people to the decisions that they make. And we're going to, in the second part of the show today, we're going to really see how that plays into the budget deficit and addressing that issue.
Yeah, I tell my students all the time, if you want to understand somebody's decision, if you want to understand their behavior, you look at the incentives that are placed around them. And if you don't like their behavior, then you need to change the incentives.
Absolutely.
And if you like their behavior, you keep their incentives the same. So this is where economics and psychology actually overlap a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, and we've come to a lot of the recurring themes is just that, and that psychology and economics and politics, they're all just kind of bundled together and how they really drive each other.
Yeah, so as we get started, let's just make sure everybody understands two simple definitions, but a lot of times they're used interchangeably. We want to make sure everybody has a good understanding. The national deficit is the yearly number. So every year, Congress has a fiscal year, a 12-month year. It starts in October and runs through the following September, in which they have an annual operating budget. And if they spend more during that year than what they take in tax revenue, that's the national deficit. That is just a 1 year. And if they have the opposite, if they have more revenue than they do expenses, then they run a budget surplus. The deficit and the surplus is an annual basis. The national debt is different. It's the accumulation of all previous surpluses and deficits.
Right.
Role playing example, let's suppose we start at zero. In year one, we have a fiscal year deficit that means we'll have a national debt. And then in year 2, if we have another deficit, then our debt gets bigger. So think about the debt as the snowball, the cumulative effects. So it's important to understand deficit and debt are two different things.
Absolutely. Good point to make that clear, because we're going to be talking about those terms as we look at some of the historical data, some of the historical charts. So I think that's important, and we'll refer back to those definitions as well. So before we get into the I want to prop your book, but I want to do that right before we talk about the theory. Let's look at some historical charts. So John's going to bring up a few charts we're going to look at that shows us that national debt. So the accumulation of the national the deficit that we incur every year. So this is the deficit. So this is the annual deficit that's incurred on an annual basis. So this is not the accumulation, this is the annual activity. So we can see those large spikes that we have there. So let's look in particular at around the 40 to 50. That's World War II. If we back up to the 20, that's World War I. So we can see that clearly when the annual spending surpassed the surplus was in war years. So if we look to the far right, we are finishing 2020 and it's already surpassed the 10% number. So we're going to look at another chart. So just in relation for 2020, other years that have been double digit have been war years. So you've heard the term this year that we're in a war against COVID. Well, that's really true. I mean, it's an economic war, it's a health war. So we've all been in somewhat of a war that we've been in, whether the death rate has been equivalent to what's incurred in a war or not. We have the economic results of that surely do look like a war year.
Yeah, and I just want to point out to everybody that the way this graph is illustrated is probably the most conventional way of illustrating the annual deficit, and that is as a percentage of gross domestic product, as a percentage of overall economic activity. Typically, it doesn't really help us understand what's going on when you just put out the exact dollar amount, whether it's $1 trillion or $500 billion or whatever the number is. Usually the more meaningful way to express it, as it's expressed here, is not in a number, but as a percentage of the overall economy.
Right. So it's always in relation or relative to the overall economy. So that's a good point. And we'll see that in another chart too that we look at in just a moment. So
right.
Let's look at the next chart, John. So this is so this chart shows on an annual basis, you've got the year in the far left column, and then if you go from left to right, the first numerical column shows the deficit for that year. So those are the equivalent to the numbers that those are the raw numbers that were incurred on an annual basis. So we had a deficit in the year. The next is the debt increase. So this shows the amount of deficit that increased for that year. And then the far right column of numbers is that percentage that we saw in that first chart. So if you look at 2020, you see the 17.9. So that correlates very well with the previous chart that we looked at that showed we're already going to be over. We know we're going to be over a 10% deficit to GDP for 2020. And that, if you compare that to other years, we're looking at war years. If you look back in the 2010-2009 year, that's when we had the financial crisis. Even in those 2 years, we didn't go over 10%. So most of the other years are 2 to 3%. Some are 4%. Some are 5, 6. And then you did have a couple of years. The surplus years are very few in number. I think there have been 4 surplus years in the charts that we looked at.
A nice way to summarize that table there is out of the last 55 years in which we have annual deficit numbers 4 of those years were in surplus, 51 were in deficit.
Wow.
So 51 out of 55 times the federal government spent more than what they took in revenue.
Wow, that's it's easy to spend more than you bring in, because that's just an easier path to get what you want. So if you look back in the 41 is when December is when Pearl Harbor occurred, December 7th, which is coming up on Monday, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day. And then you see 42, we're in full year of war then, 43 and 44. 45 is when it ended. So those were the years that we were definitely over 10% and even over 20% in those years during the war. So in any event, those are things, if you think back historically, you can understand and make sense out of that and even justify the large deficits in those years. It's really, Joe, if you think about it, 51 out of 55, we weren't in war. We didn't have war.
No, we weren't in war that many times. And especially, yes, we can basically call ourselves in war right now, but it's not a traditional war that in the way we normally use that term. But, if you think the last 20 years, we really haven't been in a traditional military war, but yet we've seen some of the largest budget deficits, either in percentage terms or in dollar terms, that we've ever seen. The national debt is growing exponentially in times of at least military peace. Now,
Right.
we've had some economic wars. I mean, we had the recession of 2009. That was very dramatic. Obviously, we're dealing with the pandemic right now. That's very dramatic. But you do have to pause and ask yourself, well, let's even remove those. Let's go to full peacetime. So let's pick out a year, 2015. Basically, everything was at peace. We weren't in a military war. We weren't in any kind of pandemic war. We weren't fighting any economic recession. Things were going very well. Why, even in a good year, do we still run budget deficits?
Right.
What's going on with our congressman and our president that even during good economic times, we're still running a yearly deficit, which is then adding to the previous years of deficits, which amounts to a very large debt? What's going on there? Well, and there's some actually very simple, logical explanations for that. So do we want to do the last chart before we get into those logical
Yeah, let's look at that last chart. And the last chart is going to, so this shows kind of what we've looked at before, plus it projects out for 20 to 2030 also. And Joe, we're keeping with the trend. We're keeping with historical results there. We don't jump above the curve and have a surplus. We're still just keep eking deficits on an annual basis. So it's, it's crazy. It's like that deficit spending has become the norm. And if you ran a business, you would be bankrupt. No bank would loan you money if this represented your business, and you would close the door, or you would what's the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Well, that's kind of what this is kind of the definition of insanity right here. I mean, 51 out of 55 years we've run a deficit year, and we're projecting that to go forward. So how are we going to do something different to change that?
Well, what's interesting is, as you alluded to, this only happens one place in American society, and that's at the national government level. Individuals can't maintain this level of deficits for that many years. Any business can't maintain that. I don't know of any state that has an exception that allows for deficit spending. Every state requires a balanced budget. State of Florida certainly does. So it doesn't happen at the state government level. It only happens at the national government level. And that's because the rules and the incentives are different at the national level. Like I said, almost every state that I know of has a balanced budget part of their constitution. They're literally not allowed to run a deficit. We don't have that kind of restraint at the federal level. So it's no surprise, once again, people respond to incentives.
Right. Yeah.
You look at a national politician, you look at a congressman, a senator, and the president of the United States. They don't have that restraint. And then you couple that with their incentives. What are their incentives? Well, their incentives are two. Number one, to get elected, and number two, to get re-elected.
That's right.
And if that's your main incentive, and I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that. I mean, if I'm running for office, certainly I want to get elected. If I have an office, I want to get reelected. So there's nothing wrong with the incentive, but the incentive then leads to decision making such that that national politician has every incentive to create immediate benefits, or at least short-term benefits, and push those costs out into the future. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that by deficit spending. You issue a bond today that says, give me the money, allow me to spend it. And that bond isn't going to come due for 5, 10, 30 years.
Right.
So I give you the benefits today, but I don't have to pay for it for 20 or 30 years. Okay, that's a great incentive to respond to getting elected and getting reelected. So as a result, what do we have? We have a deficit every single year.
Yeah, we're seeing the result of
Opposite
that.
of that is the politician says, well, I'm going to create benefits today, but if I have to balance the budget, then I also have to tax and provide fees and taxes to impose the cost today. And that's not an incentive that politicians respond to very favorably.
Right.
They don't like to make very visible costs. They like to make costs invisible or put out into the future, but they certainly like to have the benefits very visible and very immediate.
Right. Quick terms fix. So it's almost like a drug addict. We're all addicted to the money, and let's get the benefit now and we'll pay for it later. And Joe, this is what we're discussing is not, as we mentioned earlier, is not politically biased. These are economic theories, and we've been talking about the book that you're a co-author on, Common Sense Economics, and specifically today, we're on page 132, which is in section 6, which actually is addressed to this topic. Is unless restrained by constitutional rules, legislators will run budget deficits and spend excessively. That's the title of this section. And we talk about, as you just mentioned and I mentioned previously, incentives. So incentives are really driving these decisions, and that really clearly states what the result. Unless there's a higher power or higher standard that's going to restrain them from spending that money, they're going to spend it now and run up the deficits. They're going to spend more than the tax revenue that comes in to cover those annual costs.
Yeah, and it forces people to make decisions differently. So let's go back to either the individual or the individual business or even the state. If you have a balanced budget constraint imposed upon you, your choices and trade-offs are much different. You say, well, if I want this benefit, I have to give up this other one. I can't have both,
right?
Because I can't run a budget deficit. Well, if you free yourself from that, now your choices are much different. Now you can say, well, yes, I can have this benefit, and I can also have this other benefit, and I can pay for it 20 or 30 years from now. Well, that's a whole lot different decision-making process than if you're forced with some kind of balanced budget amendment that requires you to make trade-offs and choices in a much different way.
Yeah, and we're not trying to simplify the process of what creates deficit spending, because you could make an argument that more taxes are more in line with creating a surplus, or less taxes, less regulation stimulate more growth and more spending, therefore bringing in more revenue. So there's the whole argument there on more taxes or less taxes result in either less or more deficit spending. So that's really a whole nother subject, and I think we've touched on that in the past. But bottom line is, if decisions are made that result in a deficit spending, then this is what we're gonna have.
Yeah, there's no surprise that when we look at the data, any economist would predict that's exactly what you're going to get because you don't have the restraint. So this comes as no surprise to anybody. If you don't have a limiting rule, you're going to wind up with what we actually have wound up with 51 out of the last 55 years.
Yeah.
So if the American society says, you know what, I don't like that trend anymore, well, the only option is to change the rules, to impose some kind of limitation.
Was there
it have to be a balanced budget. It could be maybe that the annual deficit can be no more than 2% of GDP. I mean, there's lots of different rules that you can put into place to try to minimize this.
Yeah.
Now, the other issue is, how big of a problem is this? I mean, yes, we've seen record deficits and a growing national debt. So let's go back to pre-COVID when the economy was going well and we didn't have to deal with the virus. We had a very strong economy. So some people will say, well, what's the big deal here? Yes, we're running deficits and yes, we're accumulating national debt. But look, unemployment was historically low. The economy was growing very strongly. What's the problem here? So that's also the other thing we need to consider is, how big of a deal is this? Is this something that we really need to be concerned about? Or is this something just for a bunch of economists to talk about and have fun with?
Well,
And
Joe, that's
I
a
think
good question. You've asked that question. So, what in your opinion, is that a big deal? I mean, it seems as an accountant, as a CPA, that seems to be a big deal. That sooner or later there has to be a reckoning or an accounting for that money that we've spent in advance of receiving it.
Yeah. Well, the good news is, well, let me back up. The bad news is when you look at the data, currently the national debt is over 100% of our annual gross domestic product. I think we're in a neighborhood of about 125% right now.
Right.
Now, some people will say, "Oh my gosh, that's doomsday scenario. That's just terrible. We don't even have enough total income in our country to pay off our debt." Well, that's actually not so bad news because remember, most of that debt is in the hands of the US Treasury, and there are lots and lots of Treasury bonds that expire not just next year. If all those bonds expired next year and the debt was 125% of our income, that truly would be something to be concerned about. But like I said earlier, those bonds have maturity dates anywhere between 3 months and 30 years. So we don't have to pay that $27 trillion off tomorrow. It's not a bill that's imminently due. It's a bill that's scattered throughout now for the next 30 years. So there is good news there. The other good news is a lot of those treasury bonds and debt obligations are owned by US people.
True. That's true.
The Federal Reserve owns the biggest chunk of that. And then you've got private individuals, you've got pension funds, you've got mutual funds, you've got all different kinds of financial institutions that own that. So if we take this back to a personal level, it'd be kind of like if you were in a deficit in your checking account, but you had a big surplus in your savings account.
Right.
Well, that's not anything to be concerned about because you just owe yourself.
Right.
And that's the other thing we need to keep in mind, that a lot of this federal debt is owed to United States citizens.
Right.
Now, what some people are getting concerned about is who else owns this.
Right. What foreign governments own it?
Yeah, we're up to about 7 trillion of the 27 trillion is owed to non-US citizens, either individuals from foreign countries, or what is more likely the scenario is central banks and other financial institutions from countries like Japan and China. Most people think that China owns most of our foreign debt. And that's actually not true. Japan owns a little bit more. China is a close second, but they are second. So you have the Central Bank of China and other financial institutions in China, same thing in Japan, and scattered throughout the world. So it's not just one country, it's multiple countries. And in total, it's about 7 trillion. Now, for some people, that's a great concern. That's maybe a national security issue. For other people, that's not so big of a deal. And that's really a personal opinion about how you think that should be a big deal or a small deal in terms of how much we owe to foreign countries and foreign citizens.
All right. Well, good. So we're running out of time for our regularly recorded show that goes on the radio. So we're going to have a little soft break and we're going to continue this discussion. But one other thing, if you can address this in a couple of minutes. You got a couple of minutes to answer this question, Joe, is what is and I want to come back to another question as we close out, but Keynes. So what is the role that Keynes has played in this whole deficit spending in our history?
Well, you're referring to John Maynard Keynes,
yes,
which is actually spelled Keynes. He was a British economist, very smart guy, very famous. He came along and wrote a book called The General Theory, and he prescribed a solution to the Great Depression that was happening both in the United States and around the world. And basically, the Keynes solution is a national government should run a budget deficit when the economy is weak to try to stimulate it, to get it going. And when times are good, then they should run a budget surplus. Now, the difficulty of that is most people who implement that policy are only what I call one-way Keynesians. They only run a budget deficit.
Right.
When things are going well, they refuse to run a budget surplus. But that was the full prescription of Keynes, but it's only been followed about half the way. And it cannot be understated the enormous influence that Keynes made on both the economic, intellectual world and the political world when his book was released and then fully embraced in the 1960s. He wrote it in the 1930s, but it really came into play during the Great Depression, or excuse me, during World War II, and then the several years after that. So in terms of the so-called Keynesian Revolution, we really kind of date it back to the late 50s, early 60s. And we've seen since then, when it was fully absorbed by both the economics intellectual community and the political community, that we've seen that 51 out of 55 years.
Yeah,
So
you can
Keynes
see. Yeah,
enormously influential.
you can see where the politicians fully embrace that. At least on the one side, that kind of gave them cover that they can justify the deficit spending now. Unfortunately, they never read the other part of his theory that said,
Right. Yeah. They only read half.
Yeah, in the good times, we need to build up a surplus. So very
Right.
interesting.
Yeah. They skip that part of it.
Yep, exactly. So I'm going to leave you with this question, and we're going to roll right into this. You answering this question after the small break, but let's talk about off-balance sheet liabilities also, and how that affects this whole deficit, the accumulated deficit that we have. So we're gonna take a small little break right now for the radio show, and this is Charles Musgrove. I'm the host of Answers That Count. Thank you for joining us for another exciting episode. Those that are watching on YouTube, just hang on. We'll be right back. We're just going to take a small little break here. You won't even miss it. So hold on. You ready? Keep rolling. All right. So Joe, we're going to keep rolling. So the question is, in all of those numbers that we looked at on those charts, if I'm not mistaken, it excluded the off-balance sheet liabilities related to the Social Security. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what's called unfunded liabilities.
Unfunded,
So,
right.
So Congress has the ability to make mandates or put into place new programs and not necessarily fund them. And that's what they're called unfunded. So let's role play one example. Let's suppose that the national government comes up with a new rule that businesses need to adhere to that's going to cost money, but then they don't provide any funding for that. Or they offer a new benefit program where they're going to give people money or provide them some kind of a program, but they haven't figured out how to pay for that. So that's what we call unfunded. So the benefit is promised, but Congress hasn't figured out where the money's coming from.
So some of those unfunded benefits now are what?
Well, the two biggest ones right now are Medicare and Social Security. So Medicare is health insurance for basically for elderly people. There's an age requirement there. Medicaid is health insurance for people who meet certain economic and income levels, basically people at the lower end of the income ladder, the so-called poor people. And then you've got Social Security, those people who are hit a certain age and go into retirement. So those are the three big unfunded liabilities. So Congress has promised this formula of benefits, but they don't have all the supporting funding today to go with it.
So they don't have all of the supporting funding, however, they are collecting for that. So what's the net liability on that? I'm assuming since they don't have the deficit included in those, or the liability included in those numbers that we were looking at, they also did not include the collection of the money to pay for that, or did they?
Well, a little bit. So some of these are being funded right now. So let's talk about Social Security in particular, because that's the easiest example for people to kind of think about. Social Security is called a pay-as-you-go system. So what happens, and I'm simplifying here, but what happens is you tax the people that are currently working to transfer that money to the current retirees who are not working.
Got it.
So many people think that Social Security is kind of like their own secret retirement account, where as you were working throughout your years, the government took some of your money, took some of your employer's money, put it in an account with your name on it, and then when you retire, you draw from that. That's not how it works at all.
Right. It's
It
more
was
like a
designed
Ponzi
that way
thing.
originally, but then very quickly it turned into this pay-as-you-go system. So, for example, you and I, who are working right now, who earn a paycheck, are having money taxed away from us, and it's going directly to people who are retired right now. It's
Right.
not being set aside for us. So that's why we call it a pay-as-you-go. So the government has promised me and you a certain formula of benefits, but our benefit payments are going to come from the generation that's behind us, so that when we're retired, the people who are then currently working are going to pay for us to receive those benefits.
Makes sense.
So as you look at the formula and you project how many people are going to be in retirement 10, 20, 30 years from now, then we see this huge deficit because the benefits are way greater than the expected revenues that Congress has put into place through the current tax structure. So Congress would have to dramatically improve and increase the tax system today in order to set aside all the money that they know they're going to have to pay out in 30 years. But as we talked about earlier, no politician has an incentive to do that. You know,
Right.
you don't want to have the costs visible and immediate. You want the costs invisible and far into the future.
True. Yeah, I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the unfunded liability related to Social Security and Medicare is greater than the current deficit that we have.
Oh, yeah. Some estimates have the unfunded liability worth in the neighborhood of about $60 trillion.
Wow.
Now, a lot of that depends on how far you project out.
Right.
Obviously, if
Exactly.
you only project out 10 years, it's a small number. If you project out 30 years, it's a much bigger number. But typically, we go pretty well out into the future, especially with Social Security, because we know that you can predict Social Security much more than you can the other programs, because all you have to do is look at the demographics of your society. And you say, hey, we've got X number of people who are 30 years old. We know exactly when they're going to retire,
Right. You
or at
just
least,
right.
very closely when they're going to retire. We don't know it to the day, but, we know it within a couple of years. So those kind of projections are much easier to make because they're based on the demographics, and,
Right.
and we know how many people and what their ages are. So you can send that out into the future pretty easily.
Yeah, you just don't know what the medical cost is going to be for those people.
Right, right.
Yeah, much more of an estimate. So I'm not going to let you off too easy on that, on the question I asked you in the first part of on the show. I want to go back to it because I really think this is, your opinion on this I value that. And given the 51 out of 55 years we've had deficit spending, and we have this huge accumulated deficit right now, what would Joe, if Joe were made president, if Joe had control of the House, the Senate, and the executive branch, what would Joe do to deal with that deficit that we have?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would put in some kind of constitutional rule, because if you leave it to the individuals, then the individuals change, right? I mean, our president changes at least once every 8 years, if not every 4 years. Our Congress people come and go, our senators come and go. So you can't rely on any one group of individuals to impose a rule, because the people change. And then, of course, the rules are going to change. So I would impose some kind of constitutional rule that imposes a limit such that people can't spend excessively. I think we need a rule that tamps this down a little bit, because at some point it does become a problem. It hasn't been much of a problem till now, because again, if you go back to a pre-COVID world, we had huge deficits, but yet we were doing very well. Unemployment was low and the economy was very strong. But there will come a point in time where it is a problem, and it has been a problem in historical years, and it's very difficult to overcome that problem. So if I were president, if I were dictator for a day, I would certainly impose some kind of restraint, such that it didn't matter who was making the decisions, they were all facing the same constraint. And we do need to get this under control more than what we have done in the last 20 years.
So and I'm going to throw a couple of names out there. So the Laffer, Art Laffer, if you take his economic theory, it was more based on we're going to have high production, high productivity, lower taxes, and you can grow your way. You can have a more just thriving economy that generates more tax dollars to reduce that spending so that you then have a surplus rather than taxing more, rather than to have higher tax rates to bring in the revenue for the federal government versus the Keynesian theory.
Yeah. Well, it's not so much Keynesian versus non-Keynesian, although there is an element to that. But you have to remember a budget deficit is much like a pair of scissors because there's two moving pieces there. You've got income and expenditures.
Right.
So, on the extreme, there's one way to solve a deficit. You either gain more revenue or you cut spending.
You spend less, right.
But there is a middle ground, just like the pair of scissors. It's not the one side of the scissors that cuts the paper. It's both of them acting together. So an in-between solution is you try to raise a little bit more revenue, and then you also simultaneously try to reduce spending. It's not an either or. It can be a both. Let's try to generate a little bit more revenue, and let's try to bring down our expenditures.
Right.
And that's how a lot of people get out of their personal financial debt is they do both. They try to earn some more money. They sell some things. They take on a second job, whatever the case may be, and they try to rein in their spending. So it's not an either or. We don't have to go to extremes here.
That's very good. Very good. Very good analogy there. And your objective, when you said you'd have a constitutional amendment, that basically is our end objective. So we're going to have this restraint. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to mix the raise more revenue, cut more cost to get there.
It would allow those politicians to then decide, what are we going to do here? If we want to spend more money, and let's suppose that we had a constitutional rule that required a balanced budget. Okay, that's the restraint. And if politicians said, I want to spend more money, okay, fine, go spend more money, but then you're also going to have to come up with a way to generate some more tax revenue,
right,
to pay for that spending.
Right.
And that would result in much different decision making at the federal level.
True. And we've heard, and this is years gone past, but we've heard that in the past where, okay, we're going to reduce taxes, therefore bringing in less revenue, not making the assumption that less taxes lead to higher volume of productivity, therefore your same tax dollars come in. But if you make that assumption, okay, if we give this tax break, then we have to cut costs somewhere else to make those neutral. So you have to apply some theory, you have to apply some crystal balling, if you will, if you're going to reduce taxes. How much really is that going to reduce the net overall spending or deficit? Because if you reduce taxes, there is a theory, as in the Laffer theory, that you're going to increase productivity, and the tax dollars that come in will be more than offset by the percentage decrease.
Yeah, and just to very quickly summarize Laffer's theory, he said that depending on where the rates are, it could be that if you raise the rates, revenue goes down, but it could be that if you raise the rates, revenue goes up. And then it becomes an empirical example and exercise that you have to go through to figure out, hey, if I lower the rates, is that going to increase revenue or decrease revenue? And this is what Arthur Laffer tried to get us to understand is sometimes there's a different relationship. Sometimes rates up, revenue up. Sometimes rates up, revenue down. Right. And we need to figure out what that relationship is and where we're at to figure out what's going to happen. It's not always the case that when the tax rates go up, that revenues go up.
Right.
Sometimes it's an opposite reaction.
Yeah, it does take some sensitivity analysis. It's almost like a business that's selling a product or service. They can raise their rates a certain percentage, and it will not have an effect on how many people buy or use that service. But after a certain point, you raise it too much, and you're going to get less demand for that. So then the people will look for alternatives, or they'll use less of that product or service. So very interesting how that applies both to taxes, government, as well as businesses and how they run their business.
Yeah, it's the same kind of phenomenon. Businesses sometimes raise their prices and revenues go up, and other times they raise their prices and revenues go down. It's the same kind of thought process.
All right, so Joe, we have had it here on Answers That Count today. We've got the Professor Joe Calhoun theory on how to reduce spending, what you would do to curb that deficit spending on an annual basis. And we appreciate your opinion, and we appreciate your insight and knowledge on economic theory and how it applies to today's world and today's business and economy and political situation that we all are living in. So thank you so much.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Always great to be with you.
Man, it's been another great show, and thank you for listening. Thank you for watching our show today. Remember, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, and you can watch us on Roku TV, Fire TV. You can watch us on YouTube, and we're on all your favorite podcast channels. So check us out there. Join us again for another exciting show next week. I'm your host, Charles Musgrove. Have a great day. Have a blessed week. Peace.